Hello and welcome to my channel, Vice Rhino here. It's Meathead Monday, where I take a video from before my meaty head was on camera and redo it with my meaty head on camera. Today, I'm taking on a monumental task. I am making the jump from lack of belief atheism, in which I just don't accept the God claim, into positive atheism, where I claim there is no God. Now, just for clarity, my position is that of agnostic atheism with regards to most God claims. But when I get specific details on the characteristics of the God being claimed, that is when I can move from agnostic atheism into gnostic atheism, the belief that that specific God does not exist, rather than just a non-belief in that God. And I know there will be many people who bristle at the use of Gnostic as this sort of modifier. To those people, I would suggest that they've just come to terms with the fact that language is fluid and changing. These modifiers, as technically incorrect as they may be if you're in a formal debate setting, are excellent tools at conveying what is meant by the labels I'm using in common parlance. Anywho, what I am doing here is explaining the many reasons why I do not believe the Christian God exists, but I also do understand that there are almost as many different versions of the Christian God as there are Christians, so this will by no means be exhaustive. Anyway, let's go! Okay, so first off, we have to define what we mean by God. I think we can all agree that most Christians would suggest that their God has several omni-properties: omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and omnibenevolence. That is, God is all-powerful, all-knowing, exists everywhere, and wants to maximize the good for his creation. Specifically humans, because we were created in God's image. Now, this itself is a bit of a problem. What does it mean to be made in God's image? This means different things to different Christians. Probably the most radical view on it is that of early Christian Gnosticism. The God of the Jews was the result of the divine personification of wisdom, Sophia, deciding that she wanted to have a child without the help of her consort. The child ended up being malformed and imperfect, so she removed him from the divine realm into a lower plane of existence in order to hide him from the other divinities, and there she left him to his own devices. He then created the world as we know it, and the reason for pain and suffering in the world is this lesser god's imperfections. But when he made humans in the image of God, that doesn't mean he made us in his image, but he made us in the image of the greater divinities, the real gods. I could go into more detail about this myth. It's found in the Secret Book of John, discovered as part of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, but you'd be hard-pressed to find modern Christians with this view of God, so I mainly use it as a way of pointing out the diversity of Christian beliefs, even right from the beginning. So what do modern Christians think about being made in the image of God? According to GotQuestions.org, which is a Christian group dedicated to answering the difficult questions of Christianity in a biblical way, being made in the image of God means that we have a likeness to God, mentally, morally, and socially. Mentally, we are volitional agents with the ability to reason and choose, which is a trait that is demonstrated by several non-human animals, including elephants, lions, ravens, chimpanzees, and others. Certainly, it is a difficult thing to study without language to communicate with these animals, but as more studies are performed, the evidence is mounting that some animals have the ability to think rationally, plan for the future, and make informed decisions. So, thus far, it seems that humans and animals are made in God's image, so let's look at the next one, morally. We have a moral compass, and sometimes feel guilty about things. While we can't directly ask animals how they are feeling, behavior indicates emotion pretty well. We can be relatively confident that animals have emotions, including guilt. And animals do often display rudimentary morality. Rhesus monkeys, for instance, will usually refuse to take food when they are hungry if they know that taking that food will result in another monkey being electrically shocked. There was also an incident in the Brookfield Zoo in 1996. A gorilla named Binti Jua protected a 3-year-old child who had fallen into her enclosure from the other gorillas, taking him to a service door so that the human caretakers could get him. So, humans and animals are both capable of behaving morally, and both seem to be able to think rationally. So, again, humans and animals, thus far, are both apparently made in the image of God. So the last part was socially. Humanity was created for fellowship, to desire relationships, to have friends, etc. And really, of the 3 traits that are described as being the image of God, this one is the most well documented in nature. Even sedentary sea sponges display rudimentary social traits. Mammals are all amazingly social creatures. It's not really surprising that a species of mammal, humans, would also be social creatures. So, by this definition of the image of God, the entire animal kingdom was made in the image of God. Of course, this doesn't disprove God, but it does call into question the accuracy of the Bible verse that specifies that humans are made in God's image. And if we go past these traits that can be found in the animal kingdom as well, we find that there are plenty of places that suggest that the real image of God is found in the soul. Humans have souls, animals don't, so we are made in the image of God. QED. Except, of course, there's really no evidence of such a thing existing, and usually the evidence that is presented as being evidence for the soul ends up being the stuff that we just discussed here. So we are back to the possibility that if the soul exists, and these qualities are evidence of the soul, then animals have souls, and the image of God thing wasn't an exclusive arrangement with humans. Anyway, back to God's characteristics, let's look at what the Bible actually says about the guy. 1 John 4:8 says that God is love. Deuteronomy 32:4 says that his work is perfect, all his ways are justice, and he is without iniquity. Luke 18:27 says that he can do what is impossible for men to do. Numbers 23:19 says that God does not lie or change his mind. God not lying is also backed up by Titus 1:2. Deuteronomy 7:9 says that God is a faithful God who keeps the covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. Deuteronomy 4:31 says that God is merciful and will not forget his covenant. Exodus 34:6-7 says that God is merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers onto the children and their children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Psalm 147:5 says his understanding is beyond measure. Proverbs 15:3 says that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on evil and good. Nahum 1:2 says that the Lord is jealous, avenging, and wrathful. Exodus 34:14 backs up the jealousy bit, going so far as to say that God is so jealous that his very name is jealous. So now we have a basic picture of God, and while it is not explicitly stated in the Bible, there are many verses that do point to the omni-characteristics that modern Christians believe in. He can do what is impossible for men to do, his understanding is beyond measure, the eyes of the Lord are in all places, and he is love. That basically covers the omnis. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to be focusing overly much on whether or not the omnis are inherently contradictory in nature. I'm just going to be focusing on what the Bible says about the God who has these omni properties. I'll tackle them individually, but know that there is sometimes some interplay between them, so won't necessarily be tackling them each in a vacuum. Let's start with omnipotence. The Bible clearly, in several places, describes God as having ultimate power. I could quibble with the wording, like saying that God can do what is impossible for men to do doesn't necessarily mean that God is omnipotent, just that he's significantly more powerful than human beings. But as most Christians that I am aware of would agree that God is omnipotent, then that is the inference that I'm making here. Well, that doesn't square well with a couple of verses, the most obvious being Judges 1:19. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. So an army that explicitly had God on their side helping them defeat their enemies is unable to defeat one of their enemies because they have iron chariots. The apologetic for this one centers around the opening to chapter 2, in which God says that he is going to leave some of the Canaanites in the land with them to be a thorn in their side, because they weren't being completely obedient. But I would think that this would apply to the second half of chapter 1, where the Israelites started failing in their conquests. But verse 19 is in the beginning, where everybody was still winning, and it explicitly states that the Lord was with Judah. And actually, if we read it more closely, it looks as though the Israelites were successful in conquering these various cities and territories, but they weren't as genocidal as God wanted them to be, allowing Canaanites to live among them and be slaves rather than killing them all. So God's proclamation at the beginning of chapter 2 is him punishing them for having mercy on the Canaanites by pointing out that they are going to end up having their culture contaminated by Canaanite culture, and will end up worshipping the Canaanite gods instead of Yahweh. In other words, the other places where the Israelites did not drive out the inhabitants of a location was because the Israelites were choosing not to after winning. But the inhabitants of the plain? Those, they could not drive out, even though the Lord was with Judah because of their chariots of iron. But that's not the only place where God's power fails him in the Bible. In Mark chapter 6, we read of a time when Jesus went back home and tried to do his preaching and teaching, but the people there didn't believe him because they knew him as a child and knew his family. And in verse 5, we get the key phrase, "And he could do no mighty work there." Not, he decided not to because of how they received him, but he could not do it, was not able to. Do a handful of people not believing him to be God really have the effect of lessening God's power? How then could he be omnipotent? Now, from a secular perspective, Mark's gospel is easy to interpret in an adoptionist light. Jesus was just a normal guy who God adopted as his son at his baptism. With that in mind, this reads very much as a story of just a normal guy who left town one day, and when he came back, he was claiming to be the son of God. Well, say the people who knew him growing up, we know who his parents are. We know his brothers and sisters. Some of them are here right now. So we know he's not God's son. He's just one of us acting all high and mighty. A more cynical reading would be that of a known con man who tries to come back and con his hometown with tricks that they've already seen, and so can see through. That would explain why he couldn't perform any tricks. They knew how he did them, so he wasn't able to fool them again. And of course, all of this is ignoring one fatal flaw of omnipotence for the Christian God. Apparently, humans are actually more powerful than God because we have the power to forgive people without demanding a blood sacrifice in our name first. God apparently can't just forgive anyone who is sincerely repentant, they have to go the extra step in believing in a human sacrifice given to God in order to pay for their transgressions. Humans don't need to do that. I couldn't tell you how many times I have forgiven my kids for things they've done wrong without making them kill something first, but I can tell you that it was every time. And, of course, we also have times when God doesn't answer his own prayers to himself. The most obvious is in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus asks God to take this cup away from him, even going so far as to say that with God, all things are possible, so if you will, take this cup away from me. So this is another verse that explicitly states that all things are possible through God, and God is asking God to use his power to not make the crucifixion necessary. And yet, ask most Christians, and they will tell you that the crucifixion was a necessary part of God's plan, even though we have God right here himself admitting that it is not necessary, because all things are possible through God, which means that it is possible for God to forgive sins without having a brutal human sacrifice first. But the brutal human sacrifice is God's preference, which kind of throws out the omnibenevolence as well. A less well-known but fairly obvious example of God's omnipotence failing is in John 17:20-23. This is in the middle of a prayer that Jesus prayed just before he was captured by the Romans. Right off the bat we get, "I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word." So he's not just talking about the disciples themselves, but everyone who they convert, presumably in a continuing chain. And what is it that he's asking? That they may all be one, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. He is asking God to keep the disciples and their converts unified in message as proof that he was indeed sent by God. Had this actually happened, it would have been an immediate counter to one of the most common atheist arguments. That is, if there exists a God who has a specific code of conduct that he wants us to follow, and he loves us enough to want us to know about it, there wouldn't be thousands of religions with thousands of different sects each. There would only be one unified religion because God would make the true religion known to all. This might not have gotten rid of multiple different religions, but had God actually done what Jesus is asking here, at least the Christians would be all one cohesive group. But the fact of the matter is that the God that is being worshipped in Christian churches is a different God from church to church, even from person to person.
You think I have free choice. You think my choices have been predestined.
And they're free.
You don't even worship the same God.
Jesus specifically prayed that this would not be the case, and yet it is. Now, Jesus is supposed to be God. Did he change his mind about that and decide that he no longer wanted a unified church? Because that goes against the God does not change his mind verse from Numbers. Did he not have the ability to make sure his church stayed unified? Then he's not all-powerful. Was Jesus a separate part of the Trinity and so didn't know that the Father would answer that prayer with a no? Well, then Jesus as a God was not all-knowing. And as long as we're hanging out in John chapter 17, let's take a quick peek over at John chapter 18. I'm fond of saying in my videos that John will sometimes go out of his way to directly contradict the Synoptic Gospels, because the Synoptics paint a picture of Jesus as a fallible human, but John wanted Jesus to be God in human form, so he can't be fallible. So if we go to chapter 18, we see that John not only omits the story of Jesus praying in Gethsemane, but while Jesus is arrested, some of his disciples fight back, with Peter cutting the ear off of one of the disciples, part of the story that's also found in Luke. But where John differs is with what Jesus says right after the ear gets cut off. In Luke, he heals the man and chastises the guards for coming after him as though he were a thief or a robber when they could have just grabbed him while he was teaching in the temple. In John, after the guy's ear is cut off, he says, "Hello, what's this ear?" Sorry, that's the bad punchline of a bad joke that my father told all the time, so you have to suffer with it here. What he actually said was, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Interesting choice of phrase, given that in the other three Gospels he explicitly asks the Father to take the cup away from him, while John's Jesus seems surprised that anyone would think that he wouldn't just drink from it without question or complaint. Anywho, let's move on to omniscience. God is supposed to know everything. Absolutely everything. This one also kind of takes care of omnipresence as well. Often God's lack of knowledge in the Bible is location-based. He didn't know something because he wasn't there to see it, so we can take these two together. Now, right from the get-go, we can see that these qualities don't get along well with having both omnipotence and omnibenevolence. If God knows everything, wants the greatest good for us, and can do anything, then human society shouldn't have had to crawl up on its own with thousands of years of misery as people died from simple things like infected cuts and problems with childbirth. A loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God could have at least given us some basic knowledge about how the universe he designed worked so that we could avoid problems like this. I mean, there is something to be said for letting your kids figure things out for themselves, but there are some things that are too important to let them risk their lives not knowing until they figure it out. Like the fact that buses drive really fast down the hill in front of our house, so it's not a good idea to play in the road. We have moved since I wrote this one. It's a much quieter road. So that's nice. But if I bring that up, that gets into the self-contradictory nature of the omni properties, which I said I wasn't going to worry about here, so let's take a look at some more Bible verses. Let's start at one that we've already seen, Mark 6:6. This is where he couldn't perform miracles in his hometown because of the people's unbelief. The story concludes with a nice little line about how he marveled because of their unbelief. In other words, he was surprised, shocked, taken aback. How can you surprise God? Doesn't God know everything? Didn't he know in advance that that would happen when he went to his hometown? Now, of course, if we're reading this from an adoptionist perspective, Jesus is just a human who is really good at following God's laws, so surprise makes sense there. If you left home, had a divine revelation, and then found that you had amazing miracle powers, you'd probably want to show your family and friends too, and if most of your powers didn't work while you were at home, it might surprise you, at least a little. So that is a very human reaction at this point in the story, which is kind of the point. He's not supposed to be human, he's supposed to be God. Now, I've heard some people say that the different Gospels were written to emphasize different aspects of Jesus. He was fully human and fully God simultaneously, after all, so this one is emphasizing his humanity, while John is emphasizing his godness, which is fine, I guess, except that is itself a bit of a contradiction. John says on at least two occasions, in 16:30 and 21:17, that Jesus knows all things. Even if we're emphasizing his human nature, I don't think that an admission that he didn't know something is quite compatible with the all-knowing Jesus that is described by John. And then, of course, we have Adam and Eve hiding in the Garden of Eden. After eating the forbidden fruit, they realize that what they have done is wrong, and so they hide from God. When God arrives, he doesn't know where they are, so he has to call out to them. He is then amazed to learn that they know that they are naked, so he asks them who told them they were naked. Did they perhaps eat the forbidden fruit? Now, the apologetic for passages such as this are that God was allowing them to choose whether or not they would do the right thing. And in this instance, they unquestionably did the right thing by confessing their crime to God. And God's reaction is to then place a curse on them and all of their offspring, making it a bit of a moot point as to whether it mattered that they did the right thing in that moment. Especially if God is supposed to be omniscient and so would already know in advance whether or not they would do the right thing. Now, it reads very much like a limited God who didn't know things that were happening while he was away, which calls into question omnipresence. How can a being who is everywhere at all times possibly not have seen what they did or where they hid? Why would they hide from the sound of him walking in the garden if he is an ethereal being with a presence in every conceivable space and probably several inconceivable spaces? Clearly there would be no reason for them to hide, as such a being would already be in their hiding spot and wouldn't need to ask them about the stuff that they did while he wasn't there because he would have always been there. Now we come to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis 18:20-21, we find that God has heard reports about Sodom and Gomorrah being sinful cities, so God is going to go down and see whether they really are as bad as he has heard. God doesn't know if they're as bad as he has heard, he has to go and find out. The God who is everywhere and knows everything has to go somewhere to learn something. But I feel like we're hanging out in Genesis a bit too much. Yada yada, God didn't know if Jacob would really kill his kid for him, etc. Let's pop to the book of Judges for a bit. The beginning of chapter 2 is all about how God was getting frustrated that he kept raising up judges for Israel, and as long as the judge was alive, God was with the judge and would drive out Israel's enemies. But as soon as the judge died, they would become more corrupt than ever before. So at the end of the chapter, God gets fed up and stops helping Israel with their enemies, and it is explicitly stated that this is to test them to see whether or not they would walk in the way of the Lord. Is such a test really necessary if God already knows the outcome? And this story demonstrates that God has a breaking point. If he's omniscient, then he's going into this whole thing knowing exactly what will happen every time one of the judges dies. And yet he is frustrated that the thing he knew would happen in advance is the thing that happened. He could have chosen a different course of action and avoided this frustration, but he didn't. He is displaying either a lack of foreknowledge or that he has a masochistic streak. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Job. That whole book is about God subjecting Job to great torment to see whether or not Job would blame God for it. And yes, it could be said that it's Satan doing the testing, but he had the full blessing of God in these actions, and in chapter 2-3, it does explicitly say that Satan incited God to destroy him without reason, so it really is God doing the tormenting. And then, of course, there's the fact that Satan isn't used as a proper noun here, so it's not a story about the devil as modern Christians understand it, but rather a member of God's angelic court. That is mostly irrelevant here. In addition to the premise of the book being that God doesn't actually know whether or not Job will pass the test, it opens with God asking Satan where he's been. Kind of a pointless question for a being who knows everything and is everywhere, so would already have full knowledge of Satan's activities. Now, if we leave omniscience off the table for a second and just look at omnipresence, we also have a verse in Matthew 18:20 that says that where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there. The implication here is that he is not there when there aren't people gathered in his name, at least sometimes. Otherwise, why bother pointing out that he will be there if 2 or 3 are gathered in his name? Kind of superfluous if you ask me. So that's just a peek of some of the verses that don't treat God as all-knowing or omnipresent. How about omnibenevolence? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, as this isn't even a property that is universally agreed upon by Christians.
No problem. God is not all-loving. God hates some. It would make no sense to send somebody to hell for an eternity if God loved them. That'd be a weird way to show love, don't you think?
We agree.
God hates some.
We agree.
But again, if we're just sticking with Bible verses, in Leviticus 20:23, God detested the nations that he cast out before Israel. Proverbs 6:16-19 has a whole list of things that God hates. In Hosea 9:15, he hates Israel for disobeying him. And the book of Malachi opens with God pointing out that he hated Esau, Jacob's brother. Which is weird, because if you go back and read the story of Jacob and Esau, Esau was cheated out of his inheritance by Jacob being deceitful, and a lying tongue and a heart that devises wicked plans are both on the list of things that God hates. Yet he loved Jacob, who engaged in those activities to Esau's detriment, and hated Esau. To make matters worse, if we read the summary of the story given in Romans 9, we see that it is explicitly stated that it wasn't because of anything that Jacob or Esau did that earned them God's love. God decided which one he was going to love and which he would hate before they had done anything good or bad. And of course, the easy solution to this is that God is outside of time, so he knew which one would be good and which would be bad before they were born. But a plain reading of this verse suggests that God was either not aware of their future actions when he decided, or that he was actively ignoring those future actions. Either one isn't a great look for God, and would place him squarely outside of omnibenevolence. And of course, that's just God being less than benevolent in the Old Testament. His omni-non-benevolence really kicks into high gear in the New Testament, because that's the first time that hell shows up as an eternal torment for people who are the wrong religion when they die. As the Christian apologist Saitem Bruggencate pointed out in the clip that I played earlier, God must hate certain people in order to torture them for eternity, so he can't be all-loving. So here we have seen that according to the Bible, God doesn't actually have any of the omni-characteristics that apologists want to attribute to God. But it could just be that we misinterpreted the Bible. After all, most of the time, the verses that are claimed as describing God as having one or more of the omni-characteristics, it's written in such a way that there could be limitations. It's not actually omni, it's just way better than humans. So how about the characteristics that the Bible actually explicitly assigns to God? I listed a bunch of those characteristics earlier, so let's just do a quick recap. His work is perfect, Deuteronomy 32:4. Well, perfect is a subjective term. What is perfect for me will not be perfect for you. A perfect hammer will not be perfect at cutting wood, and a perfect saw will not be perfect at hammering nails. Because of this subjectivity, this is an easy one to wiggle out of. Personally, I would suggest that his work is not perfect. He made the Garden of Eden to be a paradise for people to live in, but a flaw in the design allowed this paradise and its denizens to be corrupted, thus ruining the paradise. But one could argue that if God's plan all along was for it to be corrupted, then it was perfect for fulfilling that plan. And that does work, but that isn't a very loving plan, and while omnibenevolence might no longer be on the table, God is still supposed to be love. Maybe not all loving, but ruining everything for everyone because of the mistakes of two people seems like a bit much. Besides that, we have in the book of 1 John a definition of God that says that God is love. We then see that 1 Corinthians 13 has a definition of love. It is patient and kind, it does not envy or boast, it is not arrogant or rude, does not insist on its own way, is not irritable or resentful, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So God should fit that definition, should he not? So, is God patient and kind? Well, in Nahum 1:2, it describes God as jealous, avenging, and wrathful. In Proverbs 27:4, it defines wrath as cruel. So God is wrathful, which means that God is cruel. Cruelty is literally the opposite of kindness, so no, God is not kind. We also have God being jealous, not only in Nahum 1:2, but in Exodus 34:14, it says his very name is jealous. But 1 Corinthians says that love does not envy. I mean, I guess you could reconcile this by pointing out the slight difference between the word jealousy and envy, but the verse in Corinthians is clearly using envy in the sense that we would normally use the word jealous. The difference is that envy is usually used to mean something you want that someone else has, while jealousy would be suspicion or apprehension at the idea of a rival edging in on something of yours, in this case a relationship. In fact, I could have cheated here and used one of the many translations that actually uses the word jealous instead of envy. Though, why that would be cheating is beyond me. I know some don't like it when I switch versions to find the wording that suits me best, but isn't it all God's perfect word? An admission that some translations can be better than others is an admission that humans are capable of messing with the word of God in a way that God doesn't approve of, which throws a massive wrench into the works of anyone who holds to biblical inerrancy. But I'm off track a bit. Back to jealousy, we see that God is jealous, his very name is jealous. But in James 3:16, we see that where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. In Galatians 5:19-21, we see that jealousy is recorded as being one of the works of the flesh, and those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So, since God is himself jealous, to the extent that his very name is jealous, does that mean that God will not inherit the kingdom of God? Is God destined for hell because he exhibits character traits that are explicitly stated to be the kinds of traits that get you sent to hell? But if we make it past the jealousy thing, we go back to the definition of love, it does not insist on its own way. Right. How many stories are there in the Old Testament of God insisting on his own way and going into a rage when he doesn't get his own way, often murdering thousands of people in the process? Sometimes it's just a couple people who were trying to do what God wanted, but did it wrong. Aaron's sons burning incense for God in Leviticus 10 got them the death penalty because it was an unauthorized offering. Probably the best known example, though, is the story of the golden calf. Moses goes up the mountain to receive the commandments and is gone so long that the Israelites don't think he'll be coming back. They then build a golden calf, which could be argued based on Exodus 32:4-5, is them attempting to provide an image for the God that freed them from Egypt, not having any way of knowing who he was or what he looked like until Moses came back to them. They just want to worship the God who rescued them, but he's been incommunicado thus far. Now, keep in mind, they have not received the commandments yet. They do not know that the God who saved them has a thing against idols. Moses has not brought the law down to them at this point. But when Moses does come down and finds them violating the law that they didn't know they had, he then has them indiscriminately kill 3,000 Israelites for having the audacity to violate these unknown laws, and it's explicitly stated that this is a command from God in verse 27. Love is not irritable or resentful. Well, the opening of Judges chapter 2 is all about how God got fed up with Israel continuing to not do as he says, demonstrating irritation. But how about resentful? Deuteronomy 5:9 points out that if anyone should dare bow down to or serve an idol, God will visit the iniquity of the fathers on their children to the 3rd and 4th generations. So if you do something that offends him, he will hold that grudge for at least 4 generations. That sounds pretty resentful to me. But then here we have another explicit contradiction. This verse clearly says that God will punish children for their parents' sins. But in Ezekiel 18:20, we see it said that the son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. So, sometimes God holds grudges. Other times he says grudges are bad, you shouldn't do that, and I don't do that. The next part of the definition of love is that it bears all things. In other words, it is tolerant while exhibiting all these other characteristics simultaneously. If someone you love does something you don't approve of, you tolerate it, you bear it, because you love them. This isn't necessarily a good thing to include in the definition of love, but hey, we're looking at the Bible's definition so we can see if God fits the Bible's definition of love. So if God is love and loves us, then the whole Jesus thing was completely unnecessary. He bears our sins and transgressions, not from his willingness to die so that he can forgive a few that love him back, but he bears all things. He forgives everyone because he loves them, and that is part of the definition of love. So the fact that only people who accept the sacrifice of Jesus are allowed into heaven goes against this aspect of the definition of love. And in fact, we have instances in the Old Testament pre-Jesus where God does forgive people without apparently requiring a sacrifice. One comes right at the beginning of the part where it says he holds a grudge. In Exodus 34:7, God keeps steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. I'm not sure how that could square with the second part of the verse where he holds generational grudges, but clearly it is possible for God to forgive without sacrifice first, as this verse says. In fact, if we want to get even more explicit, Isaiah 43:24-25 flat out says that the people did not give sacrifices to God, but have burdened him with their sins. But he chooses to blot out those transgressions and to forget the sins. God is explicitly forgiving sin for which no atoning sacrifice was made, so he clearly has that capability. But for some reason, this loving God can't do that for everyone today. Today, we have to go through Jesus, and so the vast majority of people will burn in hell forever, even though God could have chosen not to set it up that way. God cannot be love, at least not as the Bible defines love, because he violates almost every aspect of the definition of love. Okay, so now we've stripped away all of God's omnis, and we know that God cannot be love, at least not as the Bible defines love. So what's left? Well, we still got a couple character traits that people generally accept of God. He doesn't lie and doesn't change his mind. Numbers 23:19 makes that quite clear. And yet, when God discovered the golden calf, he wanted to destroy the entire nation of Israel. But Moses talked him out of it. He reminded him of his promise to make Jacob's descendants into a great nation, and warned that if he did destroy Israel, it would be said of him that he brought his people out of Egypt simply to slaughter them in the mountains. God listened to Moses and changed his mind. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God initially planned on wiping out the entire cities with no survivors. But in Genesis 18:22-33, Abraham bargained with God and got him to change his mind and agree that he wouldn't wipe out the city if 10 righteous people could be found there. And he bargained him down from an initial number of 50. Isaiah chapter 38 opens with the story of Hezekiah being told to set his affairs in order. The Lord has declared that you are not going to recover but will die. Then Hezekiah prayed for healing, God changed his mind, and he gave him another 15 years to live. Jeremiah 18:5 points out that if God decides to destroy an evil nation, if that evil nation repents, God will change his mind and spare it. And if a good nation that God decided should prosper should do evil, God will change his mind and destroy it. And of course, anyone familiar with my channel will likely also already be familiar with the verses about God regretting having made humans or making Saul king. Regret is something that you feel when you change your mind about a course of action that you took in the past and wish that you could go back and change it. So these verses actually present us with two problems. First, God is changing his mind. Second, the fact that God regrets things and has to do things in the present or future to correct for his regrets suggests that God is temporally constrained. If God were really outside of time and had complete control over time, he could simply go back in time and take a different action that he would not regret. The fact that he has regrets that have to play out and be fixed with imperfect fixes later is itself evidence that God, as described by the Bible, is constrained by the arrow of time, and once something is done, it is done. There is no way to undo it. So God changes his mind and has regrets. But does he lie? I would argue that yes, he does. Now, you could argue that God doesn't lie directly, he lies through others by sending lying spirits, so it's not God doing the lying. But no, it is God doing the lying. Ezekiel 14:9 makes it clear that if a prophet says something incorrect, God is the one who deceived the prophet. There's no lying spirit here, as there is in the case of 2 Chronicles 18:22, or strong delusion as in 2 Thessalonians 2:11. God is directly lying to these prophets. Now, personally, I would argue that sending strong delusions and lying spirits counts as lying as well. After all, who is in control of these delusions and spirits? God, obviously. So if he wants them to lie, that is him making them lie. So it is him lying by proxy. If I tell one of my kids to tell another one of my kids that they can have a chocolate bar, and then when I catch the kid eating the chocolate bar, I get angry and punish them for eating chocolate without any permission, would anyone say that I was not responsible for the deception because it came through an agent who is not me, even though it originated with me? I don't think so. What about mercy? Is God merciful? No. We saw earlier that God has the ability to forgive sins without requiring a sacrifice first, and yet God requires everyone to believe in Jesus in order to avoid being eternally tortured. He has the ability to be more merciful than he is, as demonstrated by that verse, but he has chosen not to be. We also saw earlier that God was described as being wrathful, and wrath was defined by the Bible as being cruel. One cannot be both cruel and merciful at the same time, as Commodus so perfectly illustrated for us in Gladiator.
Am I not merciful? Am I not merciful?
Is God slow to anger? No. On numerous occasions, his reaction to what should be a minor slight is to freak out and kill a bunch of people. He even tried to kill Moses once for no apparent reason. Actually, that's another example of him changing his mind. He was trying to kill Moses, then Moses' wife performed what must have been the fastest circumcision in history on her son, and then put the foreskin on Moses' feet, which then caused God to change his mind and decide not to kill Moses. And there's no context with that. That's the whole story. That's how it is. It's wild. So, after all of this has still by no means been an exhaustive study of this subject. After all, I didn't even get into the whole issue of whether it is possible to be perfectly merciful and perfectly just simultaneously, as mercy is literally the suspension of justice, but these are some of the most compelling examples of God being given contradictory characteristics by the Bible, thus resulting in the conclusion that the God that is presented by the Bible cannot exist. I do recognize that apologetics exist for each of the problems that I've brought up, but this actually kind of works against the apologists in my opinion. Because when an apologist has to explain why this thing that is obviously a contradiction actually is not a contradiction if you look at it just the right way, what is being implied there is that the Bible did not present that scenario in the right way to avoid the appearance of contradiction, making the Bible less than perfect. The very existence of apologists is itself an admission that the Bible needs help getting its message across properly, which to me suggests that the apologists think that they are better at communicating than God himself. I know that they would object to that statement, but actions speak louder than words, and they can regularly be found clarifying what God actually meant when he said or did X, Y, or Z. Why the need for clarification? God said it this way, why are you changing it? Is God incapable of communicating clearly? And on top of that, even if we ignore the problem that is inherent with the very existence of apologists, often the apologetics for such things come across as grasping at straws. I didn't even get into things like the Amalekite genocide commanded by God and carried out by King Saul, whose mercy in saving their king and some of their animals but still killing everyone else is ultimately what made God change his mind about having made Saul king. The apologetic for this is that the Amalekites were engaged in monstrous human sacrifices involving burning babies alive and whatnot. Which then leads us to ask, if killing some of their babies is their crime, how is killing all of their babies a solution to that problem that isn't at least equally heinous? Many apologetics have similar problems, but what we end up with if we look at the bigger picture rather than any one particular apologetic is a bunch of very obvious problems whose solutions have you jumping through a bunch of hoops, often ignoring context, often inventing context for which there is no evidence, stretching the meaning of words, selectively applying the meaning of words, and all sorts of other shenanigans. It does not inspire confidence. So that's why I don't believe in the Christian God. This is not a lack of belief position, this is my evidence that the Christian God cannot exist, because he has assigned multiple contradictory characteristics. Now, are the points that I made universally applicable to every iteration of the Christian God that is believed in today? No, there are people who believe that the Bible is not perfect. It imperfectly relayed God's perfect message to us through imperfect human vessels. So anywhere that shows God to be a contradictory being is a place that was influenced by the fallible authors of the Bible. That sort of God is entirely unfalsifiable. It basically falls into the same category as a deistic God. But for anyone who thinks that the Bible is perfect, these contradictions present a difficult picture of God to reconcile, to say the least. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Taylor Libby, who says, I've noticed that the atheist commenters who originally come from evangelical Protestant denominations with a long history of virulently anti-Catholic theology tend to carry those attitudes with them. Well, that may be true, but that is not true in my case. I'm sure at least a couple of the churches I went to probably would have had strong words against the Catholic Church had I asked, but personally, I saw Catholics as another branch of Christianity. They weren't the Antichrist like Jack Chick would have you believe. They weren't evil. They were just other Christians who do weird things sometimes and wear funny hats. What makes me virulently anti-Catholic today is the fact that the organization is unquestionably corrupt, has a history of corruption, and doesn't show any sign of getting better anytime soon. When an organization has a dedicated budget line item for defending members who engage in sexual misconduct, there's a problem. And people still have the gall to speak with reverence about this organization, while priests are still regularly portrayed in movies and TV shows as the good guys who impart wisdom to the protagonist. So, no, it's not my religious history that keeps my dislike for the Catholic Church kindled. It is their behavior as an organization. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the god that is worshipped by the followers that are my channel. If you'd like to not exist, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!